Your little stream is officially contained, Sergeant. The voice, dripping with the syrupy condescension of someone who has never been told no in her life, belonged to Karen, the president of our Homeowners Association. She stood with her hands on her hips, a triumphant smirk plastered across her face, her plus-size frame clad in a lurid pink tracksuit that seemed to be at war with the natural greens and browns of my property line. Between us, gleaming under the oppressive afternoon sun, was a meticulously stacked wall of tan sandbags, at least 3 feet high and stretching the entire width of the small, natural creek that separated my 5 acres from the manicured postage stamp of her backyard. This wasn't just a barrier, it was a declaration of war. I felt the slow burn start in my gut, the same controlled anger I'd learned to master in the deserts of Iraq, but my face remained a mask of calm. I'd retired from the Army Corps of Engineers as a master sergeant after 25 years, specializing in hydrology and civil engineering. I didn't just live next to this creek. I understood its soul, its every ebb and flow, its purpose in the delicate dance of this landscape. I had bought this land specifically for it, designing my home, my foundation, my drainage systems to coexist with its ancient path. And this woman, this petty tyrant of the suburbs armed with a binder of bylaws, had just damned it. "That's not a little stream, Karen," I said, my voice dangerously even. "That's a federally recognized blue line waterway, and you've just committed a felony." Her smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before her entitlement surged back, stronger than ever. "The HOA covenants, which you agreed to, Mr. Davis, state that all water features must be contained within property boundaries. Your creek was uncontained. I've contained it. I'm protecting the community's property values from your unkempt wilderness." The sheer absurdity of it, the weaponized ignorance, was breathtaking. She was quoting a rule meant for decorative koi ponds to justify damming a natural watercourse. She had no idea what she had just done. She had no concept of the physics, the immense pressure of water seeking its level, the catastrophic consequences she had just set in motion for herself. She thought she had won. She thought she had put the retired soldier in his place. All she had done was light the fuse on her own destruction. If you've ever had a run-in with an HOA that made your blood boil, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because you're going to want to see how this ends. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and share your own HOA nightmare. I want to hear them. Now let me take you back to how this all started, because this wasn't Karen's first assault on my peace, just her most monumentally stupid. I bought this land about a year after my wife Helen passed. The quiet, the trees, the sound of the water, it was the only thing that felt like therapy. The property was the last one at the end of a winding road, backing up to a state forest preserve. The 5 acres were mostly wooded, with the creek meandering right through the middle before cutting across the back corner of the adjacent lot, which happened to belong to Karen, the newly elected HOA president. My house was set back and on a slight rise, a custom build I'd designed myself. The foundation was raised slab, reinforced, with a network of French drains and carefully graded swales that would make a civil engineer weep with joy. I knew this land flooded seasonally. That was its nature. The creek was part of a larger watershed, and in the spring and during heavy summer storms, it would swell, spilling over its banks into the designated floodplain, which was almost entirely on my property. My land acted as a natural sponge, absorbing the surge and releasing it slowly, protecting the properties downstream. It was a perfect system, designed by nature and respected by me. Karen's house, in contrast, was a standard tract home built in the lowest part of the subdivision, a natural bowl that collected runoff from 3 directions. It was a terrible place to build, but I'm sure the developer got a good price on the lot. Her entire domain consisted of a 1/4 acre of chemically dependent turf grass, a kidney-shaped pool, and an award-winning rose garden she was insufferably proud of. From the moment I moved in, she was on me. The first notice was for unapproved landscaping, referring to the native wildflowers I'd planted instead of grass. The second was for the color of my mailbox, which was a standard forest green instead of the HOA-mandated beige. The third was a formal complaint about the noise from the frogs in the creek at night. Each time I'd respond with a polite registered letter, quoting the specific exemption in the bylaws for properties over 2 acres or citing state laws protecting native fauna. I was always respectful, always professional, and always right. This, I learned, infuriated her more than anything else. She couldn't stand that I knew her rule book better than she did, and that I had the experience and the law to back me up. The creek was her final frontier. She hated it. She saw it as a messy, insect-ridden intrusion into her pristine world. She complained that it lowered her property value, that it was a safety hazard, that it was an eyesore. Her campaign to become HOA president had been run on a platform of taming the wilderness at the edge of the neighborhood, which was a thinly veiled reference to my land. When she won, I knew it was only a matter of time. The final straw for her was the beaver. A young beaver had made its way down from the preserve and started building a small dam upstream from our properties. It was a beautiful thing to watch, a masterclass in natural engineering. It also naturally caused the water level in the creek to rise slightly. It didn't affect my property, thanks to my planning, but it did make the creek behind her house a little wider and deeper. She lost her mind. She called animal control, the police, the governor's office. She demanded I get rid of my vermin. I explained that beavers are a protected species and that trapping or relocating them required a state permit. And besides, it wasn't my beaver. It was a wild animal. That's when she must have decided to take matters into her own hands. If she couldn't get rid of the beaver, she would get rid of the water. That's the kind of closed-loop, idiotic logic that governed her world. So she ordered a pallet of sandbags, probably using HOA funds, and had some poor landscaping crew erect a monument to her own stupidity right on our property line. She stood there beaming with pride, as if she'd solved a complex geopolitical crisis. She hadn't just blocked a creek. She'd fundamentally misunderstood the nature of her enemy. You can't bully water. She was standing right in gravity's path. She was standing right in gravity's path. My first move wasn't to argue or to tear down her illegal dam. My first move was strategic retreat. I gave her a single tight nod, turned without another word, and walked back to my house. The high ground, both literal and figurative, was the only place to be in a situation like this. Inside, the cool air of the house was a stark contrast to the boiling frustration in my veins. I walked to the large picture window in my study that overlooked the creek and her property beyond. There it was, an ugly tan scar across the landscape. The water, which normally flowed with a gentle, burbling energy, was already starting to pool, the surface turning from a moving stream into a still, glassy pond. The flow from upstream hadn't stopped, of course. It never would. It was now pressing against her wall, a patient, relentless force. I took a deep, centering breath, the kind my combat stress instructors had taught us. Assess, plan, act. Do not react. I pulled out my phone and checked the weather forecast. My heart gave a little leap, a dark, satisfying thump. A massive low-pressure system was churning up from the Gulf, a train of thunderstorms predicted to arrive in less than 48 hours. The forecast called for 3 to 5 inches of rain, with localized amounts possibly hitting 7. It was what the weather people called a significant rain event. I called it justice. Karen had built her wall at the driest time of the year, during a late summer lull. She had no idea what this creek was capable of. I, on the other hand, had studied the 100-year flood data for this specific watershed. I knew exactly what was coming. Time was my most critical asset. I had less than 2 days to build an airtight case, not just to prove I was right, but to ensure that when the inevitable happened, the responsibility would land squarely and irrevocably on her shoulders. I went to my filing cabinet and pulled out the thick folder labeled Property. Inside were the satellite topographical maps I'd acquired from the U.S. Geological Survey, the county plat maps showing property lines and easements, and my own set of civil engineering blueprints for the house and grounds. I spread them across my large oak desk. The evidence was overwhelming. The topo map clearly showed the elevation contours. My house sat at 450 feet above sea level. The creek bed was at 435 feet. Karen's house, 100 yards downstream, had its foundation slab poured at 438 feet. But her basement floor, I knew from the developer's plans, was at 430 feet. Her entire basement was 5 feet below the bottom of the creek. The only thing that kept it dry was the fact that the creek bed, porous and deep, acted like a massive French drain for the entire area. Now she had sealed it. The water would pool, saturate the surrounding earth, and seek the lowest point. The lowest point was no longer the creek channel. It was her basement. Next, I pulled out the documentation from the state's Department of Environmental Quality. When I'd planned my build, I'd done my due diligence. The creek was officially designated a perennial blue-line stream, which afforded it numerous legal protections. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act made it illegal to place dredge or fill material into it without a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers, my old outfit. State law was even stricter, requiring an environmental impact study for any proposed obstruction. Karen's sandbag wall wasn't just a violation of HOA rules. It was a federal and state crime carrying fines that could run into the tens of thousands of dollars per day. She had handed me the ammunition, the C4, the tactical nuke. All I had to do was aim it. I spent the next hour drafting a formal, certified letter. It was a masterpiece of polite, dispassionate fury. It began, "Dear Ms. Johnson, this letter serves as formal notification that you have, on this date, erected an illegal obstruction across a protected waterway designated as stream name and ID number in direct violation of federal statute, Section 404, Clean Water Act, and state regulation, specific state code. As a licensed and retired civil engineer with extensive experience in hydrology, I must also formally advise you that this obstruction poses an imminent and catastrophic flood risk not to my property, which is adequately prepared for such contingencies, but directly to your own, located at her address. The current topographical data indicates your basement floor sits approximately 5 feet below the natural grade of the creek bed you have dammed. The impending weather system, predicted to bring several inches of rain within the next 48 hours, will inevitably cause the impounded water to saturate the subsoil and seek the lowest point, which is your foundation. I hereby demand the immediate removal of the illegal obstruction. Failure to do so will result in my reporting these violations to the appropriate state and federal authorities. Furthermore, I explicitly disavow any and all liability for damage to your property resulting from this reckless and illegal act which you have undertaken against my explicit advice and in violation of the law." I printed 2 copies, put one in an envelope for certified mail, and decided to hand deliver the other. This was a critical step. I needed a record of her receiving the warning. I walked back down my long driveway and over to her property. She was on her front porch, sipping iced tea, basking in the glow of her victory. I walked up her perfectly edged concrete path and handed her the letter. "For your records, Karen," I said calmly. "It's a formal notice regarding your dam. I'd read it carefully if I were you. The certified copy is already on its way." She snatched it from my hand, her eyes narrowing. "More of your scare tactics, Sergeant? I'm not afraid of you or your fancy letters." "I'm not asking you to be afraid," I said, turning to leave. "I'm asking you to be intelligent. There's a difference." As I walked away, I could feel her eyes burning into my back. I knew she'd probably just toss the letter, dismissing it as more of my bluster. And that was perfect. Her arrogance was my greatest ally. The trap wasn't just set. She had willingly, eagerly, walked right into it and pulled the door shut behind her. With the legal groundwork laid, my next phase was documentation. In the military, we had a saying, "If it's not written down, it didn't happen." I was going to create a record so thorough, so visually and factually irrefutable, that no lawyer, no insurance adjuster, and no HOA board member could possibly deny the chain of cause and effect. My first stop was the garage. Tucked away in a footlocker was my old surveillance and reconnaissance kit. I pulled out 3 high-definition, weatherproof motion-activated cameras. They were military-grade, with night vision and time-lapse capabilities. I spent an hour positioning them. The first was mounted high in an oak tree on my property, providing a wide-angle panoramic view of the entire scene, the creek, the sandbag wall, and Karen's house in the background. This would be my establishing shot, the God's eye view. The second I placed on a fence post much closer to the dam itself, focused directly on the point where the water was beginning to pool. This camera would capture the rising water level in undeniable detail. I placed a measuring stick, a simple yardstick, into the mud right at the water's edge, giving the footage a clear, empirical scale. The third camera was the most strategic. I discreetly placed it on the edge of my property line, angled to look across Karen's backyard directly at her basement window wells. They were those typical, ugly, corrugated steel wells, designed to let a sliver of light into a subterranean room. They were also, effectively, drains leading directly to the foundation. This camera would be the star of the show. With the camera set to record in time-lapse mode, capturing one frame every 10 seconds, I moved on to the next phase, community intelligence. Karen hadn't just made an enemy of me. A personality like hers, so abrasive and power-hungry, leaves a trail of disgruntled victims. I needed to find them. I needed to show that this wasn't an isolated incident between two neighbors, but a pattern of abuse by a board president who was out of control. I started with my immediate neighbor to the north, a quiet retired accountant named George Henderson. I found him in his garage, meticulously polishing a set of golf clubs. "George," I began, "got a minute?" He looked up, his face weary. "If it's about the HOA, I'd rather not. My blood pressure." "It is," I said, "and I think you will want to hear this. Did you see what Karen did to the creek?" His eyes widened. He'd seen the landscaping crew. He thought they were just doing some clearing. I explained the situation, her containment theory, the sandbag wall. "Good Lord," he breathed, putting down his 9-iron. "Is she insane? That whole area is a floodplain." "That's what I told her," I said. "But she's operating on HOA logic, not real-world logic." Which brings me to my question. Has she been giving you trouble? It was like opening a floodgate. For the next 20 minutes, George vented. Karen had fined him $100 for having a bird feeder. The official reason was that it attracted vermin, but the real reason, he suspected, was that a few stray sunflower seeds had landed on the edge of her lawn. He'd been forced to take it down. Then she'd cited him for his garden hose being visible from the street, another $50 fine. "She walks around with a clipboard and a tape measure, Mark," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and helplessness. "It's like living in a police state run by a meter maid." I listened patiently, taking mental notes. This was good. This was a pattern. My next stop was 2 houses down, the Rodriguez family. They were a young couple with 2 kids, a boy and a girl around 10 or 12. I'd often seen them playing in their driveway. I found Maria Rodriguez outside watering her flowers. After a bit of small talk, I gently broached the subject of the HOA. Her friendly demeanor vanished. "Her?" she said, her voice tight. "Let me guess, the basketball hoop." I nodded. "She sent us 3 notices," Maria said, her frustration palpable. "She said it was a permanent, unapproved structure. It's a portable hoop, for God's sake. My kids need to play. She said if we didn't take it down, the fines would start at $200 and double every week." They had finally given up and stored it in their garage. Her kids were crushed. The story was the same at 3 other houses. Fines for holiday decorations left up 2 days too late. A warning for a garbage can put out an hour too early. A citation for a small crack in a driveway. It was a reign of petty terror, all meticulously documented with violation notices and threats of fines and liens. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was using them as a weapon to exert control, to feel powerful. My final visit was the most crucial. I walked to the house directly across the street from Karen. It belonged to Sarah Jenkins, a paralegal in her late 30s I'd spoken to a few times. I had a hunch that someone with her professional background and proximity to the problem might be a key ally. No. I was right. When I knocked, she opened the door and before I could even speak said, "You're here about the Creek Dam, aren't you? I saw the whole thing. I've already been looking up the state statutes." I felt a wave of relief. "Come in," she said, ushering me into a home office that was wall-to-wall with books. "I've been waiting for someone like you, Mark. Someone who wouldn't just roll over." She pulled a thick accordion file from a cabinet. The label on it read simply, "Karen." "I've been documenting her abuses for the last 2 years," Sarah explained. "Every ridiculous fine, every selectively enforced rule, every threat. I've got copies of complaints from a dozen homeowners. She's violated the HOA's own bylaws on harassment, due process, and fiscal responsibility. But this, she said, her eyes gleaming with a lawyerly fire, this is different. This isn't just a bylaw violation. This is criminal. She tapped a thick, bound volume on her desk. It was the covenants, conditions, and restrictions for our subdivision. I want to show you my favorite part, she said, flipping to a section titled Indemnification of Officers. She ran her finger down the page. It says the HOA will protect and insure board members from liability for actions taken in their official capacity, except, and here she paused for dramatic effect, in cases of gross negligence, willful misconduct, or actions taken in bad faith or in violation of state or federal law. She looked up at me, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. She thinks the HOA's insurance policy is her personal shield. She has no idea that she just took that shield and shot it full of holes. When that creek floods her house, the insurance company is going to take one look at this clause, at your certified letter, and at the DEQ regulations, and they are going to laugh in her face. She is on her own, and we are going to make sure of it. The alliance was forged. We had the engineer and the paralegal. We had the evidence and the law. All we needed now was the rain, and it was coming. The sky began to turn the color of a nasty bruise late the next afternoon. The air grew heavy and thick, charged with a weird, electric stillness that always precedes a major storm. The birds went silent. A sickly yellow light filtered through the clouds, painting everything in an apocalyptic hue. It was showtime. I made a final check on my cameras, ensuring the batteries were fresh and the memory cards were empty. I walked the perimeter of my property, confirming my French drains were clear of debris and the swales were unobstructed. Everything was exactly as it should be. My property was ready. It was a fortress designed for a siege of water. I went inside, poured myself a cup of coffee, and took my seat in the armchair by the study window. It was the perfect vantage point. I could see the sandbag wall, the still, waiting pool behind it, and the roof of Karen's house beyond the trees. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering against the glass like thrown pebbles. Then a few more, and then the heavens opened up. This wasn't just rain, it was a deluge, a vertical river falling from the sky. The sound was a deafening roar on the roof and a furious drumming on the ground outside. Wind whipped the trees into a frenzy, and flashes of lightning illuminated the scene in stark, strobe-like bursts, followed by cannon claps of thunder that shook the house to its foundations. I wasn't worried. I was fascinated. I was a hydrologist watching my textbook come to life in the most dramatic way imaginable. Through the sheets of rain, I could see the pool behind the sandbag wall begin to transform. It had been about 10 feet wide. Within 20 minutes of the downpour, it had doubled. The water, dark and churning, was creeping up the banks, swallowing grass and shrubs. My time-lapse camera, with its little measuring stick, was capturing the dramatic rise. 6 inches, 12 inches, 18 inches. The water was now halfway up the 3-foot sandbag wall. Any sane person would have been out there in a panic, tearing the bags away, trying to relieve the pressure. But Karen was nowhere to be seen. She was likely huddled in her house, feeling smug and safe, completely oblivious to the hydraulic time bomb she had set ticking in her own backyard. My property was performing flawlessly. The swales I had dug were now fast-moving little rivers, capturing the immense runoff from my roof and driveway and channeling it exactly where I wanted it to go, away from my foundation and toward the lowest part of my land, where it could safely pool and be absorbed. The French drains ringing my house were gurgling happily, sipping away any water that got too close to the slab. I was bone dry. The drama was all happening at the property line. The water reached the top of the sandbags, and for a moment I thought it might just pour over. But Karen's landscapers, to their credit, had built a surprisingly sturdy wall. The water pressure wasn't enough to breach it head-on. Instead, something far more interesting happened. The water, having nowhere else to go, began to push sideways. It saturated the soft soil of the creek banks, turning the solid earth into a thick, unstable slurry. You could almost see the ground becoming pregnant with water. Then it started. A small trickle of muddy water escaped around the right side of the wall, finding a new path of least resistance. It carved a tiny channel through Karen's prize-winning petunia bed. The trickle became a stream. The stream became a torrent. The time-lapse camera I'd aimed at her house would be capturing a horrifying and beautiful spectacle. A new river was being born, right there in her backyard. It bypassed the sandbag wall entirely, flowing around it, and then, guided by the natural contour of the land she had ignored, it made a sharp right turn. The new channel was aimed directly at the side of her house, specifically at the two basement window wells I had been watching. The water poured across her perfectly manicured lawn, turning the lush green turf into a brown, swirling bog. It filled the first window well in seconds. The cheap plastic cover popped off and floated away like a bottle cap. Then it filled the second. For a few minutes, nothing happened. The wells were just two square pools of muddy water. And then I saw it, a subtle but unmistakable darkening of the siding around the windows. The water was finding its way through the seals. Then the pressure must have become too much. One of the windows, a cheap vinyl slider, bowed inward and then shattered. It wasn't a loud noise, just a dull pop that was swallowed by the storm's roar. But the effect was immediate. The water in the well instantly drained, creating a swirling vortex as it poured into her basement. It was like pulling the plug on a bathtub. A continuous, muddy waterfall was now emptying directly into Karen's house. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It tasted like victory. The storm raged for another hour, and all the while the new river flowed, a direct conduit from the dammed creek to her basement. The water level behind the sandbag wall never got much higher. The new channel was acting as a perfect, albeit catastrophic, spillway. She had wanted to contain the creek, and she had. She had contained it right in her own home. The water always wins. The rain finally tapered off to a drizzle as dawn broke, revealing a world washed clean and brutally rearranged. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and pine. I stepped out onto my back deck, coffee in hand, to survey the scene. My land was soaked but serene. The swales had done their job, the French drains were clear, and the house stood high and dry in an island of engineered stability. The creek was still swollen, but it was flowing again, finding its way around the sandbag obstruction through the new, impromptu channel. Then I looked over at Karen's property, and it was a scene of utter devastation. Her award-winning lawn was gone, replaced by a vast, swampy mudflat. A muddy 18-inch deep trench, the storm's new tributary, snaked from the sandbag wall, through her flower beds, and ended in a gaping, water-filled maw where her basement window had been. The window well was completely submerged, and a steady, gurgling sound indicated that water was still flowing into the house. It was a perfect, textbook example of cause and effect, a hydrological morality play. I knew it wouldn't be long. Sure enough, about an hour later, a shriek echoed across the quiet morning air. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and disbelief. A few minutes later, Karen came stomping through the mud, her pink tracksuit now splattered with brown sludge. Her face was a grotesque mask of fury, her hair askew. She didn't even try to navigate the path, just slogged straight through the new bog she'd created. She stopped at the edge of my pristine, unflooded lawn, pointing a trembling finger at me. You did this," she screamed, her voice cracking. "You diverted the water. You flooded my house on purpose. I'm calling the police. I'm suing you for everything you have." I remained perfectly still, leaning against the deck railing, and took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I let her tirade wash over me, a wave of impotent fury. When she finally paused to gasp for breath, I spoke, my voice calm and low. "No, Karen," I said, my voice carrying easily in the still air. "I didn't do this. You did. I have it on video." Her face went from red to a pasty white. What? What did you say?" "I said," I repeated, enunciating each word, "that I have the entire event documented on high-definition video, from 3 different angles. I have footage of your illegal sandbag wall, I have time-lapse footage of the water rising, and I have crystal-clear footage of that water being diverted not by me, but by your wall, carving a new path directly into your basement. I also have a copy of the certified letter I sent you yesterday, warning you in explicit, technical detail that this exact scenario would occur. I gestured towards her ruined yard. This isn't my fault. This is a direct and foreseeable consequence of your own actions, taken against my expert advice and in violation of federal law. She stood there, mouth opening and closing like a beached fish, the gears of her mind grinding, trying to process this new reality where she wasn't the one in control. The bluster and rage drained out of her, replaced by a dawning, sputtering panic. True to her word, she called the police. About 20 minutes later, a single patrol car rolled up. A young officer, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, got out and surveyed the scene. Karen immediately launched into a hysterical, tear-filled performance, accusing me of elaborate sabotage, of digging trenches in the night to flood her. The officer listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When she was done, he turned to me. "Sir, your side of the story?" I invited him up to my study. I didn't just tell him my side, I showed him. I played the videos on my large computer monitor. First, the wide shot showing the storm and the water pooling. Then, the close-up of the measuring stick showing the water rising against the sandbags. And finally, the money shot, the water carving the new channel and pouring into her basement window. The officer watched, his eyes widening. "Wow," he said under his breath. Then I showed him the copy of the certified letter. I showed him the topographical maps. I explained the hydrology in simple, clear terms. He was a smart kid. He got it immediately. "So her wall is what caused the water to go around and flood her own house," he summarized. "Precisely, officer," I said. "Her house is the lowest point. The water had to go somewhere. She blocked its natural path." He nodded, then went back outside. "Evidence I've seen. This appears to be evidence I've seen. This appears to be a civil matter. The obstruction that caused the diversion is on your property, and Mr. Davis has documentation showing he warned you of this specific outcome." Karen's face crumpled. But, but he has to pay for my basement. It's destroyed." "Ma'am," the officer said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "From what I can see, the damage was caused by a structure you erected. You'll have to take that up with your insurance company. As for Mr. Davis, he hasn't broken any laws. In fact," he added, glancing at the sandbag wall, "you might be the one in violation of a few environmental statutes here." He scribbled a few notes in his pad, gave us both a card with an incident number on it, and told us to have a nice day. As his car drove away, Karen stood frozen in the mud, her face a maelstrom of confusion, humiliation, and impotent rage. She had brought the full force of her authority and the law down on me, and it had all bounced off and hit her squarely in the face. The first battle was over. I had won. But the war for justice, the war to hold her accountable, not just for the flood, but for her entire reign of terror, was just beginning. The immediate aftermath of the flood was only the opening salvo. Now it was time for the strategic counteroffensive. My goal was no longer just to protect my property. It was to dismantle Karen's power structure, piece by bureaucratic piece. My first call was to Sarah, the paralegal. I described the morning's events, the devastation, Karen's hysterical accusations, and the police officer's conclusion. Evidence is a game changer. It moves this evidence is a game changer. It moves this from a he said, she said to an open and shut case of self-inflicted catastrophe. "Are you ready to go on the offensive?" "I've been ready since she laid the first sandbag," I replied. We formulated a three-pronged attack. First, the environmental agencies. Second, the insurance companies. Third, the HOA board itself. This had to be a coordinated assault on all fronts. That afternoon, I sat at my desk and meticulously compiled an evidence package for the State Department of Environmental Quality. It included high-resolution copies of the photos and videos, the USGS topographical maps with the blue line stream clearly marked, copies of the relevant state and federal statutes Sarah had provided, and a detailed notarized affidavit from me outlining the entire sequence of events. I described myself as a concerned citizen and retired Army Corps engineer reporting an illegal damming of a protected waterway. I attached the police incident report number for good measure. I sent the entire package via trackable overnight courier to the DEQ's Enforcement Division. That was prong one. The arrow was in the air. Prong two was insurance. Sarah drafted a masterful letter to the HOA's primary insurance carrier. It wasn't a claim, but a notice of potential claim and willful misconduct by a board member. The letter was polite, professional, and absolutely lethal. It detailed Karen's actions, citing her willful and bad faith violation of federal law. It included my certified warning letter to her as Exhibit A, proving she had been explicitly warned of the consequences. Most importantly, it quoted the indemnification clause from the HOA bylaws, highlighting the part that voided the board's liability protection in cases of willful misconduct. The letter subtly suggested that not only would the HOA likely be facing significant fines from the DEQ and a potential lawsuit from me for damages to the ecosystem, but that the carrier might have grounds to deny coverage for these events due to the actions of the board president. It concluded by stating that we were putting them on notice that any attempt by Karen Johnson to file a claim for her personal property damage through the HOA's policy would likely constitute insurance fraud, as the damage was a direct result of her own intentional, illegal act. We sent that letter to the insurance company's legal department with a copy to the official address of the HOA Board of Directors. This was the financial weapon. It put the entire HOA's financial stability at risk and painted a giant target on Karen's back. The other board members, who had likely let Karen run rampant without oversight, would now be forced to see her not as their leader, but as a massive liability. Prong 3 was the direct assault on her power base, the HOA board. Using a provision in the bylaws that allowed 10% of homeowners to call for an emergency meeting, Sarah and I, along with George Henderson and the Rodriguez family, drafted a petition. We spent the evening going door to door. It wasn't a hard sell. We didn't lead with my creek issue. We led with their own grievances. To the family with the forbidden basketball hoop, we said, "We're calling a meeting to address the president's abuse of power. It's time to bring back common sense." To the man fined for his bird feeder, we said, "This is about stopping the harassment and selective enforcement." My flood was simply the ultimate, most dramatic example of her incompetence and overreach. It was the smoking gun that proved she was not fit to lead. People who had been afraid to speak up before now felt emboldened. They saw a chance to fight back. We needed 15 signatures. We got 30 in under 2 hours. The petition formally called for an emergency meeting of all homeowners with a single item on the agenda: a vote of no confidence in motion for the immediate removal of HOA President Karen Johnson, citing gross negligence, willful misconduct, violation of state and federal law, and actions resulting in significant financial and legal liability for the Homeowners Association. We filed the petition the next morning, as per the bylaws, delivering it to the HOA secretary. They were now legally required to hold the meeting within 10 days. The pieces were all in motion. The DEQ would be investigating. The insurance company would be panicking. And the community was finally mobilizing. Karen, meanwhile, was living in her own personal swamp. I saw a disaster restoration van parked in her driveway for 2 days. They pumped out tens of thousands of gallons of muddy water. I saw them carrying out ruined furniture, soggy carpets, and black garbage bags full of destroyed belongings. The cost, I estimated, would be astronomical, and I knew with a grim sense of satisfaction that her homeowner's insurance would almost certainly deny her claim. Most policies have a flood exclusion, and even if she had a separate flood policy, it wouldn't cover damage you intentionally caused to your own home. She was trapped. She had built her own prison of mud and debt, and I was methodically locking all the doors. I felt no pity. This was the cold, hard math of consequences, a subject she had avoided her entire life, but was now being forced to learn in a brutal, immersive course. The first sign that the official machinery was grinding into action came 5 days later. A dark green sedan with the state seal on the door pulled up in front of my house. A man in his 50s, with a weathered face and a no-nonsense demeanor, got out. He was wearing a polo shirt with a Department of Environmental Quality logo embroidered on the chest. He was holding a clipboard in my evidence package. "Mr. Davis?" he asked as I met him on the driveway. "I'm Frank Miller, senior field investigator with the DEQ. I got your report. Thought I'd come see this for myself." I walked him to the back of the property. The water level in the creek had returned to normal, but the evidence of the flood was stark. The sandbag wall stood as an ugly, muddy monument. The new channel carved through Karen's yard was a deep, unmissable scar. Frank Miller stood on the bank for a long time, just looking. He walked over to the sandbag wall and kicked it with his boot. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "30 years I've been doing this, and the stupidity still manages to surprise me." He took out a camera and began documenting everything, taking photos from multiple angles. "This is a Class 1 protected stream," he submitted. "It's a Class 1 stream, so it's illegal to build a channel in it." "This is a Class 1 protected stream," he said, more to himself than to me. "Spawning ground for native trout. The fine for something like this starts at $10,000 a day, per day." He looked over at Karen's house. "Who's the genius responsible for the Public Works project?" "That would be the HOA president, Karen Johnson," I said. "Lives right there." She called it containing the stream. Frank let out a short, harsh laugh. "Containing it, right. Well, she's about to get contained in a world of legal and financial trouble." He walked right over to her front door and knocked. I watched from a distance. Karen answered, her face still puffy and strained. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see the dynamic. Frank was calm, pointing toward the creek, his pen gesturing toward items on his clipboard. Karen started off defensive, her hands on her hips in her signature power pose. Then as Frank continued to speak, her posture began to crumble. Her hands dropped to her sides. Her shoulders slumped. He handed her a thick packet of papers, which she took with a trembling hand. He had just served her. The DEQ investigator's visit was a public spectacle. Neighbors who were working in their yards or walking their dogs stopped to watch. The sight of an official state vehicle and an investigator in a government shirt spending 2 hours documenting a violation at the HOA president's property was electrifying. The whispers started. The narrative Karen had tried to spin, that I was the villain, was visibly collapsing. I was the one cooperating with the state official. She was the one being served with papers. Later that day, the second shoe dropped. I received a call from a man named Arthur Vance, a senior claims adjuster for the HOA's insurance company. "I just want to thank you for your 100th birthday." "I'm familiar with it," I said dryly. "I just want to thank you for your proactivity in sending that letter," he said, and I could almost hear the relief in his voice. "Your documentation was exemplary. We have launched a full internal investigation into Miss Johnson's actions. I can confirm for you that she did attempt to file a substantial claim for her basement flood under the HOA's general liability policy." "And?" I asked. "The claim was summarily denied," he said. "Our position is that the damage was the result of an intentional and illegal act performed by the claimant, which is obviously not a covered peril. Furthermore, we have informed Ms. Johnson that her actions, which she took in her capacity as board president, have placed the HOA's entire policy in jeopardy. We are currently reviewing whether her willful misconduct constitutes a breach of the terms of our coverage." The implications were staggering. Not only was Karen on the hook for her own massive repair bills, but she had single-handedly threatened the insurance coverage for the entire community. This was the kill shot for her presidency. All that remained was the public execution. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday evening in the community clubhouse. The air in the room was thick with tension. It was standing room only. Nearly every homeowner was there. This was the biggest turnout anyone had ever seen. Karen and the other 4 board members sat at a long table at the front, looking uncomfortable. Karen was trying to project an air of authority, but she looked haggard. The stress was clearly taking its toll. The meeting was called to order, and as per the agenda, the floor was given to me to present the case for the vote of no confidence. I walked to the podium carrying a small laptop. I connected it to the projector that was aimed at a large screen behind the board. "Good evening, everyone," I began. "My name is Mark Davis. Most of you know me as the guy at the end of the road with the woods. Many of you only know me through the lens of the violation notices and complaints filed against me by our president, Ms. Johnson." I clicked a button, and the first image appeared on the screen. A picture of my property, green and peaceful. This is my home. I chose it for its peace and its natural beauty. Specifically for this. I clicked again, and a picture of the creek flowing gently appeared. This creek is the heart of my land. It's also a protected state waterway. Last week, our HOA president decided, without consultation, without authority, and in violation of the law, to do this. The next image was a stark, brutal photo of the sandbag wall. A collective gasp went through the room. She claimed she was containing it under HOA rules. I warned her, as an engineer, what would happen. I warned her in writing. I put a slide of the certified letter up on the screen, its key phrases highlighted Titan. She ignored the warning, and then the storm came. I didn't need to show them pictures of the flood. They had all seen the aftermath. Instead, I changed tactics. But this isn't just about my creek. It's about a pattern of behavior. It's about this. Click, a picture of George Henderson's empty bird feeder hook. Mr. Henderson was fined for attracting vermin. Click, a picture of the Rodriguez's empty driveway. The Rodriguez family was threatened with hundreds of dollars in fines for a child's basketball hoop. I went on, slide after slide, showing pictures of the violations that Karen had persecuted her neighbors for. The cracked driveway, the garbage can, the holiday lights. And it has now led our community to the brink of financial and legal disaster. Sarah then took the podium. She didn't use pictures. She used cold, hard facts. She explained the DEQ investigation. She held up a copy of the citation Frank Miller had served, explaining the potential for tens of thousands of dollars in fines that the HOA would be responsible for. Then she delivered the final blow. She explained the call from the insurance adjuster, how Karen's actions had led to the denial of her own claim and were now threatening the entire community's liability coverage. We are at risk of becoming uninsurable, Sarah said, her voice sharp and clear, because our president decided to play God with a creek and in doing so, violated her fiduciary duty to protect this community. The motion on the floor is to remove her. For the good of this community, for our property values, and for our own peace of mind, I urge you to vote yes. The vote was a landslide. It wasn't even close. By a margin of 58-3, the three being Karen and two of her cronies on the board, Karen Johnson was removed from her position as president of the Homeowners Association, effective immediately. She sat there stunned as the result was announced. Her reign was over. The tyrant of the suburbs had been deposed by a united front of fed-up neighbors, armed with facts, photos, and the righteous anger of the wronged. The aftermath of Karen's public dethroning was swift and deeply satisfying. Stripped of her title and her clipboard, she seemed to shrink, the aura of intimidating authority evaporating into the stale air of the clubhouse. The remaining board members, shaken and facing a room full of angry homeowners, immediately moved to elect an interim president. Sarah Jenkins was nominated and approved by a unanimous roar of support. Her first act as interim president was to formally apologize to me, Mr. Henderson, and the Rodriguez family on behalf of the HOA, and to declare all outstanding fines and violations issued by Karen over the last year null and void. A wave of applause and relief swept through the room. The community had taken its first breath of free air, but the consequences for Karen were only just beginning to cascade. The HOA, now under new and competent leadership, had to deal with the mess she'd left behind. The first order of business was the DEQ citation. Sarah and I met with Frank Miller. I presented a remediation plan I had drafted, a detailed engineering proposal for the professional removal of the sandbags, the restoration of the original creek banks with natural erosion-controlling vegetation, and the proper filling and resodding of the illegal channel in Karen's yard. Frank was impressed. "This is more thorough than what most engineering firms would submit," he said. He agreed to the plan and, in light of the HOA's immediate and responsible action under new leadership, he significantly reduced the fines. The final amount was still a painful $5,000, a check the HOA had to write from its reserve funds. At the next meeting, Sarah proposed a special one-time assessment of $50 per household to cover the fine and the cost of the professional restoration crew. It was a bitter pill for the homeowners to swallow, paying for Karen's mistake, but Sarah framed it perfectly. This is the cost of letting a bully go unchallenged for too long. Let it be a lesson to all of us to stay involved and hold our leadership accountable. The assessment passed. Every homeowner had to write a check because of what Karen had done. She was now not just a deposed president. She was the woman who had cost every one of her neighbors money. Her social standing in the community plummeted from feared to despised. The most exquisite piece of karmic justice, however, came from the insurance world. As predicted, her homeowner's insurance carrier denied her claim for the basement flood. I later heard through the neighborhood grapevine that the denial letter explicitly cited damage resulting from an intentional act by the insured which altered the natural flow of surface water, referencing the sandbag wall. They wouldn't pay a dime. She was now facing a catastrophic repair bill, easily in the range of $50,000 to $70,000 for full water remediation, mold removal, and rebuilding, entirely on her own. But it got worse. The HOA's insurance carrier, having completed its own investigation, sent a formal letter to the board. They were not dropping the HOA's policy, thanks to the board's swift action in removing Karen. However, they were formally pursuing Karen personally for the costs associated with their investigation and for acting in bad faith. They were essentially subrogating against her, treating her as a hostile third party who had caused the liability. On top of her basement repair costs, she was now being sued by the very insurance company she thought was her shield. The financial walls were closing in on her from all sides. A for sale sign appeared on her lawn about a month later. It was a hasty, desperate sale. At a massive loss to a house flipping company that specialized in distressed properties. The last time I saw her was on moving day. She was directing the movers, her face a permanent mask of sour resentment. She happened to look over and see me sitting on my back deck, watching the newly restored creek flow freely. Our eyes met across the property line. There was no fury left in her gaze, just a hollow, defeated bitterness. She had lost everything: her power, her money, her home, her reputation. She tried to muster one last glare of defiance, but it faltered. She just looked tired and broken. I didn't gloat, I didn't smile. I just gave her a slow, deliberate nod. A nod that said, "This is what happens. This is the inevitable result." She turned away and got into her car, a woman erased from the community she had tried so desperately to control. I sat there for a long time, listening to the sound of the water. It was the same sound as before, a gentle, timeless burble. It had been there long before Karen, and it would be there long after. It had faced an obstacle, and it had simply found a new path. It had endured. Then I heard another sound, the happy shouts of the Rodriguez kids. I looked over and saw that their portable basketball hoop was back in the driveway. A little further down, I could see the glint of sunlight off of Mr. Henderson's newly reinstalled bird feeder. The neighborhood was healing. The petty tyrannies were over. The fight had been about more than just a creek. It had been about the principle that rules are meant to create order, not to be used as weapons for personal vendettas. It was about the simple, powerful idea that expertise should be respected, not dismissed by arrogant ignorance. It was a fight for the soul of a community, and we had won. The water, as always, had found its level, and so it seemed had justice. The seasons turned. Summer's oppressive heat gave way to the crisp, cool air of autumn. The leaves on the trees lining the creek turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson before falling to blanket the ground. The restoration crew had done an excellent job. The ugly scar of the sandbag wall was gone. The banks of the creek stabilized with native grasses and willow saplings that would grow to hold the soil. The channel that had been carved through Karen's old yard was filled, graded, and covered with fresh turf by the house flippers, who were busy gutting and renovating the property. From my deck, the landscape looked almost as it had before, peaceful and whole. But it wasn't the same. The whole neighborhood felt different, lighter. The oppressive weight of Karen's reign had been lifted, and in its place, a genuine sense of community began to grow. The new HOA board, led by Sarah, was a model of sensible governance. They held open meetings where residents' opinions were actually solicited and respected. Their first major project was a complete review of the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Sarah asked me to chair a small committee to rewrite the sections on landscaping and property maintenance. We threw out dozens of petty, unenforceable rules. The mandate for beige mailboxes was abolished. The rules about holiday decorations were relaxed. We wrote in new language that encouraged, rather than punished, the use of native plants in waterwise landscaping. We clarified the rule about unapproved structures to specifically exempt things like children's play equipment and garden sheds that weren't visible from the street. We transformed the bylaws from a weapon of oppression into a framework for respectful coexistence. The change was palpable. People started talking to each other more. There was a neighborhood barbecue in the fall, the first one in years. George Henderson brought his famous chili. The Rodriguez family brought their kids, who played tag with other children on the clubhouse lawn. I found myself in a long conversation with a new resident, a young doctor, about the migratory birds that followed the creek corridor. There was a sense of shared ownership, of belonging to a place that was now governed by reason instead of resentment. My role in the community had shifted too. I was no longer the reclusive sergeant at the end of the road. I was Mark, the engineer who had stood up to the bully. People would stop me on my walks to ask for advice about drainage issues or to thank me for what I had done. I was initially uncomfortable with the attention, but I came to realize that what they were thanking me for wasn't just getting rid of Karen. It was for reminding them that they had a voice, that a single, well-prepared individual could fight City Hall, or in this case, the HOA, and win. The house flippers finished their renovation of Karen's old place and put it back on the market. A young family with 2 toddlers bought it. The first time I met the new husband, he was standing in his backyard, looking at the creek. "Man, we're so lucky to have this," he said to me, gesturing at the water. "The kids are going to love it." "It's a good creek," I agreed. "Just make sure you respect it." He laughed. "Oh, we heard the stories." The realtor had to give us the whole disclosure. The previous owner, the sandbags, the flood, it's legendary. "You're the guy, right? The engineer?" I admitted that I was. "Well, Bajan," he said, extending a hand, "I'm a plumber. I know a thing or two about water flow. Let me just say, on behalf of my profession, nice work." We shared a laugh, a moment of understanding between 2 men who appreciated the simple, powerful laws of physics. That winter, the first snows fell, blanketing the neighborhood in a quiet layer of white. The creek still flowed, a dark, determined ribbon cutting through the snow, steam rising from its slightly warmer water into the frigid air. I sat in my study, the same chair I had sat in during the storm, and looked out the window. The world was quiet, at peace. My fight with Karen felt like a lifetime ago, a strange, dramatic chapter in an otherwise quiet life. I had learned things from it. I had learned that my training in the Army, the discipline, the strategic thinking, the importance of documentation were more than just professional skills. They were life skills. I had learned that a community is not just a collection of houses, but a delicate ecosystem of relationships that requires care and attention to thrive. And I had been reminded of a fundamental truth I first learned as a young engineer studying the power of rivers. You can never truly defeat nature. You can work with it, you can respect it, you can even divert it for a time, but in the end, it will always find its way. Water always seeks its own level. It's patient, relentless, and unforgiving of arrogance. And in its own, own, unhurried way, it always delivers justice. My peace had been threatened, and I had fought to restore it. But the victory wasn't just the quiet I had now. It was the shared peace of the entire neighborhood. The sound of children playing, the sight of neighbors talking over fences, the simple, beautiful flow of the water, finally and forever, uncontained.